It's your friendly neighborhood TA, Eleanor. I'm here with my mug and my squeaky chair to talk about knowable and unknowable things. I love YouTube and I love YouTube essays. So when Rick asked me if I'd be willing to give this lecture, I was really excited because it's a chance for me to impersonate some of my heroes. I say lecture because who knows what the hell this is going to turn out to be. Am I allowed to curse? Management says that light cursing is okay. Hopefully whatever this turns out to be, it'll be fun and informative. So, in true YouTube fashion, I'm going to occasionally point to some parts of the screen that I would like you to click on, but instead of asking you to smash that like button, oh my gosh, I'm going to provide some links that you can click on to send me an email or to start a Canvas discussion or a question on Piazza, whatever seems most appropriate. So hopefully if we time it right, I can place those at key moments that make it more convenient for you to ask any questions you have that maybe sort of naturally occur in the course of me talking at this camera. And hopefully that'll make it a little bit more interactive. And also in the true fashion of YouTube, and especially the niche video essay bread tube videos that I watch, I'll be breaking this video down with timestamps. So I won't actually be breaking the videos up into those nice kind of segmented chunks that Rick has been doing, but hopefully my little timestamps will effectively take the place of those chunks. And with that, let's get into it. Part 1. What can we know? So what can we know? And maybe the appropriate reaction to that question is, what do you mean, what can we know? And I think my answer is truthfully, what can we know? Like, as broadly as possible. Like, what can we know? Like, for sure. So it turns out a lot of people, have asked this question before. In fact, there's a whole branch of philosophy about this question called epistemology, which according to Google is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. And wait a second, one of the 4 main branches of philosophy? Well, I guess that makes sense because philosophy is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. But jokes aside, you may be wondering, okay, why are we talking about philosophy? And what was up with that reading we did for today? Doesn't seem super relevant and was hard. And also, this is not a philosophy class. And I want to argue that a basic kind of philosophical grounding is actually really important for scientists. Rick agrees, which is why he's infused this method-y kind of class with a lot of history and philosophy of science topics. Sorry, you can tell that I'm not a professional YouTuber by the everything about this video, but including the change in lighting, so sorry about that. I may be a little bit more all in on the philosophy than Rick is, though, which is why he asked me to give this lecture today. Full disclosure, my dad is like a real employed professional philosopher. I'm so proud of him. Research for this video included... Hey Dad, what's the difference between metaphysics and epistemology? And also, what is metaphysics? And also, what can we know?
Are you serious?
2 hours later.
I really do think, though, that a kind of philosophical backdrop to the scientific research that we're interested in pursuing, and Rick and I are interested in teaching you as psych instructors, is really important. we have to be clear on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what kind of answers we can expect to get out of our scientific endeavors before we can really dive in. This may sound really daunting, and I mean, it sort of is. I guess all philosophical questions are kind of lifelong pursuit. So we don't need to figure everything out right now. In fact, we couldn't even if we really wanted to. I mean, did you catch what I said earlier about epistemology being one of the main branches of philosophy? If all those philosophers haven't figured it out enough to come to a consensus after hundreds of years, we're probably not going to within this one lecture. But that doesn't mean it's hopeless for us, and we still have a lot to learn from those philosophical struggles. Plus, luckily, we don't really need to figure it all out. We just need to sort of get oriented within the discussion so that we can have some perspective as we go on to do some science. Part 2. What have some previous scholars thought? Okay, so maybe I've convinced you that talking about this philosophy stuff is worthwhile, I guess. So what is all this epistemology stuff that we're supposed to know about? Epistemology, study of what we can know. Okay, we have to know what we can know before we start trying to know new things, which is sort of what science is about. Where do we start? So actually, this is where the reading comes into play. So if you remember, in section 5 of this Chisholm reading, which I hope was intelligible to you, but we're going to break it down a little bit. Chisholm talks about how to figure out what to know, right? Section 5. Okay, I'm going to put it on the screen. In section 5 at the beginning, he says, we can formulate some of the philosophical issues that are involved here, meaning how to know what to know, by distinguishing 2 pairs of questions. These are, A, what do we know? What is the extent of our knowledge? So question A is kind of like, what's the list? If I had to make a giant list, what is the content of the stuff on that list? And question B is, how are we to decide whether we know? What are the criteria of knowledge? So if I were going to paraphrase these questions again, question A, what do we know? I guess that's how that's how I paraphrase it. What is the stuff that we know? Can I list it? And then question B is really, how do we know what to know? What is the source of knowledge? And Chisholm goes on to describe 3 different options for how to approach these questions. So I'm going to break down a little bit what he said about the 3 types of approaches, and then I'm going to continue to talk about those 3 approaches, but I'm going to use a little bit of different terminology. So hang with me. I'm going to try to break it down. Okay, so when you think about A and B, there's kind of 3 approaches, and this is exactly what Chisholm lays out. The sort of easiest one to understand is the approach of the skeptic. And when we talk about skepticism in a philosophical context, we don't just mean somebody who's like, really? Are you sure? Not just kind of casual skepticism, like your friend said something and you're like, I don't know about that. But it's kind of a radical skepticism. Skepticism that we can know things at all. So basically the way Chisholm talks about this is the skeptic, when given these 2 things, A and B, would say, okay, well, to answer A, what do we know? You have to know the source of what you can know. So to answer A, you have to be able to answer B. But to answer B, how do we know, like, the source of the things we can know? You have to kind of know if the source can be trusted, which you can only validate by knowing if those are the kinds of things you can know. So to answer A, you have to be able to answer B, but to answer B, you have to be able to answer A. So it's this loop. You can't get started anywhere. You can't really know anything at all. That's the skeptical approach. But then Chisholm talks about Methodists, not the Protestant denomination Methodism, the philosophical denomination, and the particularists. And basically, these are the people who pick either A or B as your approach. If you have if you have somebody who thinks you can answer B, and then from your answer to B, what is the source of knowledge? How do we figure out what we know? And then from that, you can answer A. What are the things that we know? That's a methodist. And that makes sense. There's a method. The method matters more than the content. And then the flip side of that, people who think they can answer A before they can answer B, what are the things that we can know? And from that, you can extrapolate to the sources, because the sources are the things that validate the things that you think you know. Those are the particularists, which again also kind of makes sense because those are the people who care about the particular content over the method. So hopefully that clears up for you a little bit of what Chisholm was talking about. So just to recap right there, the three stances, given these two propositions A and B, or the two pairs of questions rather, not two propositions, you get people who think can't answer anything, people who can answer A and then from that answer B, or people who can answer B and from that answer A. Methodists and particularists, these are very nice, kind of solid meat and potatoes philosophical labels. One thing I think actually is a little aside that's quite difficult for people who are getting started in philosophy is that the vocab feels really impenetrable, and the vocab is so important. You have to know what the word means, like Methodist, for example, you have to know what that means, but you also have to know the context of like all the background ideas that make Methodism what it is. Oh, leaf blowing. So hopefully that little explanation cleared up some of the reading, but now I would like to connect those terms from the reading to terms you're more likely to encounter, especially in a scientific context. Let's ground this in a little bit of history. Have you heard of Descartes? The I think therefore I am guy? Here he is. Look at that smug little smile. He knows he's thinking. He knows he exists. I'm sorry, this isn't a Descartes roast. So Descartes, as Chisholm said, thought that bad beliefs, bad knowledge, infected your other beliefs, like COVID. Too soon? Too soon. Too soon. So Descartes had this project where he wanted to just be able to sit down and just get really clear on which beliefs were the not bad ones. What can you really know for sure? So Descartes just sat down and decided to just kind of cross off all of the things that he couldn't totally be sure of. And actually, Descartes' meditations are worth reading. I mean, he kind of goes crazy. But this process of sort of eliminating all of the beliefs that you can't be sure of is kind of an interesting one. And basically, what Descartes is able to sort of cut down to is the only thing he can like really, really know for sure is that he is thinking. And if there's a him to be thinking, then he must exist. Okay, so he knows that he's thinking, and he knows that he exists. That's it? I mean, that's really it. That's all he thinks he can be sure of. So, not a lot to work with, but it does rescue you from the clutches of skepticism. You can at least know those things. And as a quick aside, if you are all feeling very interested in all of this, which I hope you are, if you are interested and would like to know more details, because this is very much just a gloss, I encourage you to look into the Philosophical Foundations of Cognitive Science class, which is offered through the Cognitive Science major. I was a Cog Sci major at IU, loved that class. I'm very happy to talk to you about it if you would like to. So actually, let's take this opportunity, click this link to send me an email if you'd like to know more about any of the things that I've just mentioned. Okay, so we've got Descartes. And when you think about his methodology, he's really reaching these conclusions through not observation, right? He's not like collecting any data. It's sort of through intuition and analytical thinking. And so you could say that this is a particularist approach. as Chisholm says. Descartes is approaching the question of what can we know from the proposition A, like what is the content of what we can know. And what Descartes can know is that he exists and that he's thinking. So people who kind of continue on in that stream of Descartes, where you sort of build your knowledge off of maybe things you can observe, but also your intuitions, kind of a mixed bag of resources, those people are called rationalists. Again, it's more complicated than that. I'm not a professional employed philosopher, and my dad can't answer every question that I have. Actually, he's very nice. But he's not in charge of this lecture. I am. Those people are called rationalists. So, Descartes did his thing, rationalism. Cool. Then there was kind of a backlash around the time of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was roughly during the 1700s, sort of extended on either side of it. The Age of Reason. People were really into being very sure about what they knew. And because of some philosophers like Locke and Hume, there was a rise of a school of thought called empiricism. Okay. Now you're like, empiricism, that kind of sounds like empirical. Maybe we're getting closer to science. I'm going to wrap this up. Don't worry. It's all going to tie in. Empiricists are Methodists. Empiricism is a Methodist, the Chisholm term, approach to what you can know. What is the source of your knowledge? And Locke and Hume were both empiricist philosophers. They were both pretty extreme. And this kind of radical empiricism, what is the method that you can know things? The method is through your senses. All you can trust are the sensations that you can experience. What are the things that you can observe and measure through your senses? Okay, observation, measurement, sounds like science. Very nice. But empiricism gets a little tricky. So think about this. The claim is that the only things you can know are the things that you sense, that you directly observe. Well, you start to run into problems of inference. Let me tell you what I mean. So imagine, you don't even have to imagine, this is true. The sun has risen every day of your life. I promise. And every day that you were paying attention, I bet you noticed. So yeah, that's the thing that we feel like we know, right? That the sun is going to rise, rises in the east, sets in the west. I am not pointing to the correct directions. But if all you can know is what you sense, then you can't be sure, actually, you can't know that the sun is going to rise in the east and set in the west tomorrow. All you know is that it always has. You can make a prediction. In fact, the past is usually pretty good at predicting the future. But you can't know for sure. So you can't do these kinds of inference tasks. And you can't even be sure about the past either when you think about it. All you can really know is what you're directly sensing right now. No. Okay, so that seems a little dicey. Here's another problem. Think about the empiricist claim. All that I can know is the stuff that I directly sense. How do you know that all you can know is the stuff you directly sense? Did you know that through sensing it? That seems like not an empirical claim. And maybe that seems like a little bit of a dirty trick or something, but it is actually kind of a problem. Like, you can trust your senses, but deciding that your senses are the only trustworthy source of information is actually not a radically empirical claim at its center. Okay, so hopefully that's like confusing in the right ways and not confusing in the wrong ways. But you can see why, philosophers have been fighting about this forever. And you can also see why skepticism in some ways is an easy out. Then you can just say that you're not really sure about anything. But maybe you notice that Chisholm in this article is a little bit skeptical of skeptics. I think Chisholm thinks nobody's really as skeptical as they claim. Although I don't know, I haven't met every skeptical philosopher. Some of them are probably crazy. Skepticism can lead to pretty crazy beliefs, right? Like solipsism. Have you heard of this one? That's when you think you're the only thing that exists and everybody else out there is a figment of your imagination. Or, like that you're living in the Matrix. Actually, fun fact, The Matrix was the first rated R movie I ever saw because my dad decided it was a good teaching opportunity for some philosophical concepts. Again, these sort of three categories that in some ways map nicely onto Chisholm's skepticism, Methodism, and particularism. Instead, we have skepticism, that one really sticks around, rationalism, and empiricism. So I realized as I was editing that I accidentally messed up the order in which I said these terms, as you can see from my little whoops text overlaid. So what I'd really like you to get is this kind of correspondence of skepticism to skepticism, obviously, Methodism to empiricism, and particularism to rationalism. And as I was thinking more about these terms, I realized that the relationships between them are kind of complicated, so I wanted to make this chart to help make it as clear as possible, given the fact that I messed up the order earlier. But so the relationship from Chisholm's term skepticism to my term skepticism, those are the same concept, one-to-one. I want you to think of empiricism as a kind of Methodism. Empiricism is the method of knowledge is through the senses, through sensation and observation. And then for the purposes of this class and this discussion, you can think of rationalism as a kind of particularism. If you're interested in talking about the nuances of this anymore, I'm happy to talk more about this on Friday in our discussion. And I'm actually going to leave you with a little link to a Canvas discussion. So feel free to click right here. To make sure that we understand this, let's take a fun BuzzFeed quiz. Welcome to BuzzFeed, where you can lol win OMG cute and what the f***. Today's quiz is, what kind of philosopher are you? It's a short quiz. Are you ready? First question. Do you think you can know anything? If you answered no, congratulations. You're a skeptic. If you answered yes, please proceed to the next question. Next question. Do you think the only source of knowledge is through the senses? If you said no, you're a rationalist. It means you think you can have other sources. If you said yes, congrats. You're an empiricist. End of quiz. Part 3. What can science tell us? Okay, so now hopefully we're a little bit oriented in this history of philosophy that's relevant. And now the next question is, so what does science have to do with all of this? How does science fit in? How do we bridge this gap? What can science tell us? And hopefully your intuitions are sort of following where I'm trying to lead them along the path of this lecture, extended metaphor, which is that science is very closely tied to this idea of empiricism. And actually, science is very closely tied to Chisholm's idea of Methodism. Because like Rick has talked about earlier in this semester, science isn't just a big list of facts. This is kind of like what Stuart Firestein said in that TED Talk. Science isn't just a list of facts. Science is a method. The scientific method is a way that we try to learn new things. We try to expand what we know, to expand the circle of ignorance, like Stuart Firestein talked about. Yeah, how is science connected with empiricism? So empiricism says that we can only learn things through our senses, and sort of expanding that just a little bit, expanding maybe senses as apart just from our 5 basic ones like vision, hearing, taste, smell, touch. Observation can be extended to sort of anything that we can measure about the natural world. So the question then is, what is the domain of science? What is the scope of things that science can answer questions for us about? And the answer is basically anything about the natural world that you can get measurements on, anything that you can observe, which starts to make it sound like maybe everything is in the domain of science. And I think some people really do think that. And there's definitely interesting ongoing debates surrounding that question. But I'm going to tell you a little bit of a kind of fun, classic thought experiment that calls some of this into question. Part 4. What can't science tell us? Right, so maybe a better angle for trying to understand what the domain of science is to figure out first what's not within the domain of science. If anything in the domain of science is stuff that we can be sure that we're taking accurate measurements of, that relates to some of the earlier stuff we were talking about in the semester of if psychology is a science, which we have all agreed it is. Psychology is a science. But I think the room or the early debates, well, the ongoing debates really, about whether or not psychology is a science has to do with whether or not people are convinced that you can take accurate measurements about things that are happening sort of internally in the mind. I mean, I, as a psychologist and cognitive scientist, know that there are tools that allow you to take measurements of human behavior that really do get into the cognitive mechanisms. It's not just a black box in there. And hopefully we're going to be imparting at least some of those tools to you over the course of this semester. But here's an example, here's a little thought experiment of the kind of phenomenological experience that's related to psychology. It's often tied up with debates around consciousness that maybe isn't within the domain of science. So this thought experiment is called the Mary problem. If any of you are on academic Twitter, it seems like everybody's always talking about this. There is a woman named Mary. Mary lives in a black and white world. Mary has been raised in a completely colorless environment. Everything in her environment is black, white, or grayscale. I mean, I don't know how they could have done it. It's a thought experiment. Maybe there's no mirrors and she's always wearing gloves and there's nothing organic in her house. Who knows? It's a thought experiment. But let's really think that she's never seen color. And yet, Mary knows a lot about color. Mary is a color scientist. And in fact, Mary knows so much about color. Mary knows every single factual scientific thing that can be known about color. She knows all about the color wavelengths. She's done a lot of research into the human eye. She knows how the receptors work. She knows about how light permeates the atmosphere. She's read lots of accounts of how people feel when they see color, the kind of symbolic meanings of color, cultural import. Mary knows everything there is to know about color. Okay. Then, one day, Mary steps outside and sees a rose. And so, this is the first time that Mary has ever seen the color red. In fact, she's never seen any color before. And so the question at the heart of this thought experiment is, has Mary learned something new? And if she has, what is it? Because she knows everything there is to know about color, and yet a lot of people sort of intuitively feel that the experience of seeing the color red is an instructive one. It's a kind of experiential knowledge that you can't get just from knowing everything there is to know about the eye, about wavelengths, etc., etc. Philosophers call this special kind of experiential, phenomenological knowledge qualia. Qualia, what is it? Nobody knows. And qualia is often at the heart of these kinds of consciousness debates, these sort of like, what is the edge of the scientific domain questions. Can science tell us something about qualia? Just like all these things, philosophical debates, I suppose the jury is just permanently out. But I do think that a lot of respectable philosophers think that qualia, that kind of experiential knowledge, it's just something that you can feel and experience, is not within the scientific domain. And can't be, because it can't be measured or quantified or sort of added. There's no way that you could take that kind of experiential knowledge and add it to the body of knowledge that, like, Mary already had. There's nothing that Mary could have learned in her colorless room that could have been equivalent to that. Does that make sense? I'm going to link right here some resources on the Mary problem if you're interested. There are lots of sort of fun philosophical thought experiments like this. I mean, there's debate within the scientific community of whether or not these kinds of thought experiments are scientifically productive. For one, there just couldn't really be a Mary problem in real life. Qualia isn't usually so cut and dry separated from the body of scientific knowledge. And it also just makes sense that scientists aren't really interested in talking about the things that are sort of outside of the scientific domain, whereas philosophers are very interested in that. I would say that scientists are often much more interested in updated, like the ever updating empirical findings to add to what we know. And philosophers are often much more interested in creating these sort of fine-grained distinctions, like what is the scope of scientific knowledge. Obviously, people run the gamut in terms of their interests and their positions on these kinds of things. But hopefully the Mary problem gives you a good example of where the scope of science sort of ends. Other examples include debates about consciousness. There's just no evidence to sort of decide between what has consciousness and what doesn't. We don't have enough evidence to decide between the schools of thought. And so you have to somehow figure out what you think apart from science. And that brings me to the last part of this video. Part 5. How do we know what to think about the things that science can't tell us? So maybe as you're thinking about all this, you're realizing that a lot of things maybe that are important to you turn out to lie outside of the domain of science. I mean, big questions like, does God exist? And what's the meaning of life? Just to name a couple. Maybe that's not a surprise. I don't know that anybody ever really thought that science was going to be able to tell you the meaning of life. And that's not to say that science can't inform what you end up believing about those things. But some of the specific questions or the actual content of what you know is not going to be something that you're going to be able to go out and empirically measure. So what tools do I have at my disposal, if not the scientific ones? How do I know what to think about the things that are not within the scientific domain? And I think that's a really great question. And I encourage you, first of all, to think about that for yourself for a moment. Because there already are things in your life that I'm sure you have beliefs and opinions and knowledge about that lie outside of the scientific domain. And so I encourage you maybe even just to pause the video for a second to reflect on how it is you already think about those things without the tools of science. But the answer is that there are lots of other tools. Science isn't the only tool to being a good critical thinker. I would hope that we all really care about what can we know and hope that the things that we know are true and worth knowing and that the method by which we know them is a good one. We care about the problem of the criterion, again to return back to the Chisholm reading. And so maybe it is a bummer that science can't answer all of the things. Science really is a tremendous tool. I don't mean to downplay that. I suppose I'm ending this video on sort of a weird note. But the question I want to leave you with is, what are the approaches that you can take to the things not within the domain of science? But yeah, so just because things are outside of the scientific domain doesn't mean that it's not within anybody's domain. So just like everything, it comes down to who your authorities are, your intuitions, kind of a rationalist approach. Which domain you think has a claim on your particular problem. That's going to define what kinds of tools you end up using. And, you know, think about what the philosophers are doing. You know, sometimes it's science, but it's usually not. But you can still get very clear on the implications of the knowledge, consequences of which knowledge source you rely on, knowledge categories, and how far certain premises or commitments in your knowledge and beliefs will get you. Like I said, think about the domains. You know, religion and faith-based systems are not usually doing science, and yet they're very structured, very scaffolded. And just because science can't tell us what to think doesn't mean that there are no right answers at all. Obviously, people still get things wrong. People have bad intuitions. You know, there's all kinds of pseudoscience claims. And hopefully as we get further along in the semester, we'll talk later about how people are often forming and updating their beliefs based on a very complex network of the beliefs they already have and sort of social information and not really rigorous independent scientific research. So it's good to know what domain you're in. It's good to make sure whether or not you're in the domain of science, because if you are in the domain of science, you should use scientific tools. And if you're not, employ your critical thinking. And that is the note that I would like to leave you on. Thank you so much for watching my very first video essay. I'm going to leave a couple links here on the side. I'm going to leave a link to my email. I'm going to leave a link to a Canvas discussion. And then I'm also going to leave a link to the lecture quiz, which has, I haven't made it yet, 5 to 7 multiple choice questions that'll all just be, if you watch this video, if you're paying attention, should be easy. I will see you in class. Does that even work? I've always wanted to do that.